Hi. A couple of things. I'm going to sort of level set about urban and about resilience. I'm not technically a water person, although we'll talk about how water is integral to almost every single resilience challenge across all 100 cities and really beyond. I'll confess, I'm actually a bike person, a transport person, first and foremost. I think cycles, there isn't an urban problem that cycles can't fix. And I'll just come out and tell you my bias right now. Anyone have an urban problem that you want to throw out at me, and I'll connect it to bicycles? Money. Flooding. So that's it. Yeah, of course. I mean, that's an easy one. One of the things that we're seeing in many cities is the introduction of green infrastructure proximate to rivers and streams that helps relieve the stress on those rivers and streams and makes them and mitigates flood risk. We saw it most dramatically in Boulder a few years ago. They had introduced a cycleway that was part of green infrastructure next to the Boulder River. And when Colorado was impacted with tremendous and catastrophic flooding, Boulder did much better than its neighbors. So, I mean, for me, that's an easy one. But, obviously transport and transport and mobility, cycles are good for. Our burgeoning public health, obesity, heart failure crisis, cycles are good for. They're good for small businesses and getting to know our neighbors. If we're bowling alone, cycles are good for that. Cycles are good for everything. I won't mention them again, but I just wanted to warm up and say that's my point of view. And it's really and the reason why it's important is because it's sort of this integrated approach to problem solving that's so important in terms of resilience. So before I really talk, I'm going to show a short video about 100 resilient cities. That will relieve me mostly of talking about the program, and then I'll go and talk a little bit about what urban resilience is, how important it is to water, and some of the trends we're seeing. And then we'll have an amazing panel to really dig into some of those issues. So with that, maybe we can roll the video.
Our hearts yearn for best in life. It is very, very important that cities answer the challenges of real social issues.
Who knows what's going to happen? So maybe we should be preparing for what we don't expect the unexpected. A resilient community actually knows how to respond no matter what happens.
It's very clear that we are faced with a number of problems, both emanating from nature and man.
We have to consider that everything is done keeping resilience in mind. It is a step going from reactive to proactive.
The inception of 100RC from the substantive side starts with Rockefeller's deep engagement in cities for decades.
In 2013, the foundation was celebrating its centennial anniversary, and it wanted to make a big statement. And it looked around the world and it saw three major trends: urbanization, globalization, and climate change. More than 50% of the world's population, for the first time now, lives in cities. And that number is expected to grow to 70% by the year 2050. Globalization refers to the fact that what happens in one city now more and more affects what goes on in another. More and more cities are at risk to the effects of climate change. They sit in some of the most vulnerable areas, whether that's river deltas, on coastlines, or in high plains that are more impacted by drought and rainfall shortage. And so in order to recognize both their centennial but also be responsive to these macro trends, the foundation announced 100 resilient cities.
The four core offerings for 100 resilient cities: first, a chief resilience officer; second, help and assistance in creating a resilience strategy; third, access to a platform of services and partners; fourth, access to a network of cities and chief resilience officers. The Chief Resilience Officer is that single point of contact in a city, someone who has the trust of the city's leadership, ideally works closely with the mayor, but is also able to work throughout all the different silos of city government and throughout all the different silos of the city itself.
Mais le fait que les CRO soient positionnés à un niveau hiérarchique élevé dans les organisations municipales est réellement susceptible de nous aider à conduire notre mission de la meilleure manière possible.
So the first thing that a CRO does after they're hired is begin to develop a resilience strategy for their city. And the first part of undertaking that strategy is like taking a physical for the city. They need to understand what the overall resilience health is, so where they're strong and where they're weak, where they're healthy and where they're fit and where they're not.
A lot of the planning processes and strategies that are developed are about the strategy itself, and then you're done. And with 100 Resilient Cities in this process, it's really about implementation.
To help the cities actually solve their challenges, there will be access to a platform of services.
100 Resilient Cities platform is a funded suite of tools, services, advisory support from the leading nonprofit, academic, and corporate sector partners who have all contributed their time and resources to help our cities execute upon their resilience strategies and achieve their resilience goals.
The quality of the partners that are accessible to us is really something a city like Norfolk just couldn't afford.
In addition to all of the great platform resources, this is when the network actually of all of these global CROs can provide one city all of their global institutional knowledge.
La oportunidad que tuvimos de encontrarnos con otros CROs, de saber que no estábamos solos, no que hacíamos parte de una red con un compromiso mayor con el mundo.
The city has to believe in what they're trying to achieve. They have to identify with the risks and exposures, and then we can figure out how to complement that. We can't accomplish very much as a platform partner without the motivated city behind it.
So I go back to my city, fired up, and absolutely sure that I will engage even more with my Chief Resilience Officer to put this right at the heart of what we do.
We are working in 100 cities with the aspiration of sparking a resilience revolution in 10,000 cities around the world.
As the 100 are built out and they are working together, they actually, we hope, will become the linchpin of a global movement around building resilience. They will represent 6 continents. They will represent a depth of understanding about what resilience means and how to build it.
Cities are the future. They're both our biggest risk and our greatest hope to solve climate change, to solve sectarian conflict, to solve overpopulation, crowding, human needs issues.
So that's really the long-term play for us. 100 is great, 10,000 is game-changing.
That was a little introduction about what 100 Resilient Cities is and what it's trying to do, and I'd be happy to field some questions during the panel or in the break about how we're approaching this as an organization and a theory of change and what we're trying to do. But right now, I'm going to talk a little bit about what resilience, and urban resilience specifically, is, and some of the things that we're seeing in terms of the big trends and the ways we want to go. And the first is that cities, why resilience is so important is that it looks at problems and solutions, at risk and opportunity in an integrated way. And just a couple of examples sort of ripped from the headlines. In Athens, Greece, impacted by macroeconomic and fiscal crises, a refugee crisis, at risk to serious heat waves and climate change, and exacerbating a seismic risk profile. You see all of those issues wrapped together in Athens, Greece. In Mexico City, probably one of the best examples of water and its various tentacles and how it impacts the resilience profile of a city. You have a city that was built in a lake above an aquifer. That aquifer has become broken and destroyed, which has led to subsidence. That has caused buildings, foundations to shift, exacerbating the massive seismic risk that the city already faces. At the same time, the ground is no longer able to absorb rainwater, so Mexico City floods on a much more frequent basis. And they spend lots and lots of money and effort to import drinking water and is really at an existential risk to running out of water long term. And so you see all of the various strands of that being wrapped into one in Mexico City. In Accra, Ghana, it's really a question of waste, health, and sanitation, the WASH risks. You get consistent flooding, which leads to chronic cholera disease that circles back on itself. And what is happening in Accra is a sort of donor darling. So there's lots of different organizations in there, but they're all looking at it in different sectoral, specific, isolated ways. You have people who are working on waste, you have people who are working on health, you have people who are working on sanitation, but there's not really this integrated approach across those, and that's what the resilience framework is meant to do. And finally, this is not just developing world problems. You have obvious risks here in the US, and particularly in New York. You have one of the most exposed cities in the world to storm surge and climate change. Almost 700 miles of coastline in the city alone, and yet you have growing problems of inequity around race, around social issues, around a hollowing out of the middle class, and we're becoming a city of only very rich and only very poor. And so the resilience perspective and the resilience lens is asking ourselves how we think about those challenges in integrated ways, and I'm going to suggest some ways that cities begin to do that. So what is urban resilience, just as a sort of level set here? Urban resilience is quite simply about a city's ability to survive disaster. But don't just think about it as the sudden disasters, the earthquakes, the hurricane, the flooding, terrorism, hazardous materials incidents. But think about it as the long-term slow burn disasters, long-term food, water, and energy shortages. You can think about it as high levels of crime and violence, and I'm going to talk about Medellin, Colombia in a bit as a way of an example, a long-term stress that really, existentially threatened the city of Medellin, Colombia. And you can think about it as shifting macroeconomic trends. It's worth pointing out that in the US, the one city that's almost been wiped off the map didn't come because of a hurricane or an earthquake. It was Detroit. It is Detroit. Overexposed to a single industry, the American automobile industry, and that industry has become less competitive, and that has posed real issues for the city. So serious that Detroit has been demapping the center of the city and actually turning blocks in the center of Detroit back into farmland and really wasteland. And it's not just, that's not just a one-off, actually. We see many of our cities around the world being big ports: Rotterdam, Panama City, to some degree New York, Oakland and San Francisco, LA, and so on. And if global production changes in a way that disadvantages shipping, there will be real serious problems for those cities. I mean, with 3D printing, we're not going to need to ship goods. We're not going to need to manufacture goods in one place and ship them to another. We're going to produce them right here, right now. And that's going to significantly disadvantage some of our cities. So thinking about urban resilience in all of these contexts, and just to give you a sense of what that looks like, let's see. In Medellin, Colombia, in 1988, the city was the murder capital of the world. You had massive murders, you had crime, violence, and destruction, as you see here. And you have Medellin today, a city that just won the Lee Kuan Yew Prize for the most livable city in the world. And made this remarkable transformation. And what happened in Medellin? Well, they began to look at their problems as interconnected problems. They started to see violence and transportation and community cohesion, all of those things, as interrelated in the right, in very active and very intentional kinds of ways. And what you have in Medellin is you have a mountain city that the main economic center is in the valley floor, and you have poor communities up on the hillsides. And in the late 80s and early 90s, what you had is you had to make a 2-hour on the back of a motorcycle or in a dangerous bus trip down the mountainside to get to the valley floor, to get to the formal economy. And what they did is they had what you can see as a single transportation intervention. You had outside escalators that you see here, connected to gondolas, what they call the metro cable, connected to bus rapid transit. And that changed that 2-hour commute to a half-an-hour commute. And all of a sudden, you connected these dangerous slums on the hillsides to the formal economy in a much more direct and much more efficient way. And that reduced murder in Medellin, Colombia by 90%. Now, it's not the only thing that happened. They had to also capture and kill Juan Pablo Escobar. Cocaine trade, globally has changed in different ways. So I'm not trying to oversimplify this, but it gives you a sense of how a single intervention around transportation can have many different impacts. And not only does this have an impact on violence, it also enhances community cohesion, where you have people having more time in their families and their communities. It's better for the environment because this is all clean and sustainable transportation. It's better for the economy because it connects an informal economy, which was going on in these communities on the hillsides and these slums, to the formal economy in the valley center. And that makes Medellin better able to survive and thrive in the face of whatever the next disaster is, whether it's a return of chronic crime and violence, an earthquake, or flooding related to climate change. So, to give you a sense of this, and I talked about this 2 years ago, and we're continuing to use this and to refine it. I won't spend a long time on it. What is it that makes a city better able to survive and thrive in the face of all of these shocks and stresses? And we've got this framework that we've put together. It's actually going to lead to an index. So there's a quantitative aspect at the end I'll talk a little bit about. But maybe just to give you a sense of what are those characteristics, what are those qualities and capacities that allow a city to survive and thrive in the face of all these disasters? Well, it starts with the human. Cities that better meet basic needs around food, water, and energy. Cities that better support livelihoods and employment, with diverse economies, good middle-class job base. And of course, cities that have public health services and emergency management. All of those things allow cities to withstand the next disaster. But it's also about economy and society and this cohesive and engaged communities where you have neighbors who check on neighbors, where you have strong family structures and community institutions. For me, I will have to say this is one of the big differentiators. And if you're not familiar with the NYU sociologist work, Eric Kleinenberg, around the heat wave of 1997 in Chicago, I highly recommend it. Kleinenberg looked at the heat wave in Chicago, which killed nearly 800 people. You would expect that rich communities that had air conditioners and poor communities that didn't would perform differently. But what Kleinenberg found is actually there are differences in how poor communities performed. You had some communities that were coming apart, where people were living alone, where there were mostly renters, where there were lack of neighborhood institutions, people didn't know each other, there wasn't walking on the streets, and those communities had some of the highest death rates. And you had other communities, same socioeconomic status, but much different kinds of communities where you had strong churches and community institutions, where you had strong family structures, where neighbors did really check on neighbors, and those had some of the lowest death rates in the city. So thinking about how, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the interventions, but thinking how cohesive and engaged communities can support this. Social stability, security, and justice. This is around both the provision of fair and equitable justice, law enforcement, but also about lack of corruption. We see corruption as one of the big indicators of fragility and brittle cities. And of course, macroeconomic prosperity. Infrastructure and environment. This is the most tangible and direct link to to water, cities that provide and enhance natural and man-made assets. This is both the built environment, of course, houses, bridges, roads, and so on, but the natural environment. I talked a little bit about Mexico City and its aquifer. We see this all the time. You saw some of the tragic flooding in Colombia a month ago. That was a result of the hillsides being deforested. We see this in lots of places all over the world. People had deforested the hillsides, the rains came, the mudslide happened with tragic results. The natural and man-made environment, of course, continuity of critical services, and reliable communications and mobility. The final part, the piece of the puzzle that allows cities to survive and thrive in the face of any disaster, to be more resilient, is around leadership and strategy. Integrated leadership, long-term plans. We'll hear about Singapore, an amazing example of long-term planning over 50 years that's been followed. And you need strong stakeholders at the table. If you have all of those pieces, you're better able as a city, you have the capacity to survive and thrive in the face of disaster. And the last thing, you won't be able to see the outer ring, but I mentioned that this is a framework, and it's been incredibly useful at a qualitative level, at a framing kind of level, to get cities involved in assessing where their weaknesses, where their risks are, where their opportunities are. But what the outer ring shows you is that each of those 12 drivers I just went over very quickly is connected to a number of subdrivers, which are then connected to variables. And what we're in the process of doing is putting together an index that will allow cities to assess themselves, to understand more quantitatively how they're doing in terms of their capacity in resilience, and how they can, and hopefully, and I have to admit that there is some real debate about whether this will be a successful effort or not, for a bunch of reasons, mostly around complexity and size. Hopefully it'll allow them to identify where the right interventions are and how those interventions can help improve the resilience footprint of the city. So just quickly shifting gears then, and to talk a little bit about the network of 100 cities. What we did is we put a challenge out over 3 different years to choose the 100 cities. We had over 1,000 applications over that 3-year period. 95, as part of the application, we asked cities to rank sort of their top challenge, their top shocks and their top stresses. And over 95% of the 1,000 applications listed water, either too much water, too little, or oftentimes both, as one of their challenges. So clearly a massive challenge across the cities. We have, and I don't show the list here, in the 100, it's an incredibly diverse group. It's big cities like Mexico City and Rio and Jakarta and Lagos, Nigeria, and it's small cities like Painesville, Liberia, and Vejle, Denmark, and Tulsa, Oklahoma. And it's high capacity like New York and London and Paris, and it's low capacity like Samarang, Indonesia, or Da Nang, Vietnam, and it's everything in between. And the reason for that is it was alluded to at the end of the video, that what we're trying to do is not just change how 100 cities view their risks and opportunities, not just provoke them to do that in a more integrated, inclusive, risk-aware way, but we're trying to actually change how cities all over the world, 10,000 cities, that was that reference. Depending on how you count it, there might be 10,000 cities in the world. And cities are funny things. They could be administrative districts, they could be metro areas, they could be a lot of different ways to count it. But depending on how you count it, there might be 10,000 cities in the world. And what we're trying to do is provoke this change in 10,000 cities. So the 100 are intentionally diverse so that every city around the world, big, small, rich, poor, high capacity, low capacity, will be able to see themselves in one of the 100 and take inspiration from them. And one last thing about the network, and I'd be happy to, if people are more interested in the network, I'd be happy to talk more about that, that you would think that the rich cities would teach the poor cities that the learning would go from global north to global south. And in fact, that's not the way it happens at all. That cities, when they get down to the kinds of things they want to do, and they get down to the tactics and the problems that they're experiencing, that really many of the developing cities have lots to share and teach the wealthy cities. We just held a network exchange in Athens, Greece on refugee crisis, and we had a bunch of European cities who are most under the gun in terms of refugees and migrants. And we invited a number of other cities that had experienced that in the past, one of them being Medellin, Colombia, that had been the subject, had been the destination of hundreds of thousands of internally displaced people over the 80s and 90s due to the civil conflict in Colombia. And it was Medellin, actually, that showed many of the European cities, including Athens and Thessaloniki, Greece, but also including Rotterdam and Paris, about the best practice intake solutions and how to integrate refugee operations and migrant resettlements with some of the things that you were doing already for your citizens, and to find those synergies and that resilience dividend in there. So you'd look at this map and you'd say, yeah, London and Paris teaching the rest of the world, and New York teaching the rest of the world how to do things, but actually that learning really does go in many different ways. So a little bit about what we're learning and some of the big trends, and then I'll stop. So the first is that we need to use climate and water investments in order to build social capital. And we need to design integrated solutions to address current and future challenges. And let me talk a little bit about these two slides. So first, this is a water park in Rotterdam. So Rotterdam is a Dutch city that is connected to a massive port, as I talked about. Over 50% of the residents of Rotterdam were born outside the country. So it's a massive new sort of population. The Dutch have traditionally not done integration well. They've always done water well because they're faced with this threat ever since they woke up to in the 1953 flood. And what this park does is it's able to hold thousands and thousands of stormwater gallons in tanks that sit in and below what you see here. And it does that during the wet times and thus mitigates the impacts of floods in the city of Rotterdam. And yet it also builds social capital because you can see it's a 5-a-side soccer pitch, it's basketball courts, it functions as a community theater, there's a skateboarding park. It's places for at-risk residents to meet and mingle and build that social capital and learn about what it means to be Dutch and a Rotterdammer and European and so on. And also, frankly, to teach the Dutch what it means to be an immigrant and a refugee and a new resident. And so it's these kinds of interventions that we're seeing become more and more important. How do we deal with the water challenges? The Resilience Mind asks us, how do we deal with the water challenges that we're facing at the same time as we start to build social capital? Because the next thing that happens is not going to be a water crisis of any kind. It's not going to be flooding or a drought or drinking water shortage or fresh water shortage. Those things are coming. I'm not denying that. But the next thing you deal with will be the cops shooting an unarmed motorist. There will be a blackout. It'll be an explosion of some sort or whatever. And so what resilient cities try to do is to build that holistic capacity and address those issues with every intervention. I'm not sure who's heard of the Big U. Has anyone heard of the Big U? So I mentioned New York at risk to storm surge and sea level rise. And I've been working on those issues since the mid-90s, and I can remember being laughed out of community meetings in Breezy Point and on Far Rockaway in the mid-90s when I tried to talk about the hurricane risk in New York. And many of my friends live in Breezy, And I was in London when Sandy happened, but I was following their Facebook chat, and they were gearing up for a great hurricane party, and you could see the messages become more and more dire until it was like basically pray for us. And luckily, most people survived, and the Rockaways and the city generally has begun to recover and bounce back. But the question then gets asked: how do we protect New York City, in particular Manhattan, the most valuable piece of real estate in the world? How do we protect this area from future storms and sea level rise? And previously, what we would have done is we would have had engineers estimate how big the seawall needed to be, and we would have mixed the concrete, and we would have built the seawall. And what the Big U did through an integrated, design-led, community-engaged process, an inclusive process, was propose a much more interesting and integrated solution, and one I would argue is going to make New York City stronger for whatever the next thing that happens. And so what you see here, let's see is green infrastructure that raises the elevation along the East River to what it needs to be given the 2-degree estimates of where the sea will be and how that will increase and intensify coastal storms and storm surge. Really interesting proposal here is that if you're in the Lower East, if you're on the Lower East Side, and you need to get to the park, you have to go up these very narrow stairs, across this very scary bridge, down the other side, and you get to the park. And there's only a few of those. And what this proposes is that because you now have raised the elevation of this park to the top, basically, of where the FDR is, you can lay generous at-grade pedestrian bridges over the FDR to more effectively connect the Lower East Side to the park. And what I don't show here, but what is in the design, is that there are all these amazing other aspects of this design around biodiversity, around better exercise facilities, around community gathering and meeting spaces, all of those things that will help us meet our neighbors, reduce some of the public health effects of a sedentary life, will reduce the impacts of the urban heat island and the coming heat waves that happen. All of those things will happen as a result of this seawall. And so these are the kinds of integrated solutions that we're going to need in order to face an uncertain future that has water at the center of it, but also, frankly, has many other challenges that we don't know about. And the interesting thing about this is, so we have about $1 billion to fund the first section of this. It's about a $15 billion U around Lower Manhattan, kind of think of it from 23rd Street to 23rd Street. And the interesting thing about this is, how do you build and how do you maintain this infrastructure? You do this amazing design with some of the top designers around the world. We engaged the community through this Rebuild by Design process over basically a year, where community gave impact, designers did redesigns, came back to the community, did it over and again, and had this really amazing process. But then you got to give it to someone to build. And if you give this to the Parks Department, the Parks Department knows how to optimize for parks. And so you start to squeeze the resilience benefit out of it. And so I think that's going to be one of the next challenges over the next decade or two as the city starts to build this. How do you keep all of this resilience dividend that I talked about around community cohesion and exercise and biodiversity and heat waves and flood and storm protection in this project? So the second is that when we talk about resilience building and water issues, that requires a regional approach. And this is particularly true for water systems. This is Mexico City. So let's first start with New York. Let's first start with New York, one of the most powerful cities in the entire world. You've got a mayor who's responsible directly for 5 counties. Anyone want to guess? You're all New Yorkers. Anyone want to guess what the annual budget of New York City is? It's massive. $85–90 million when you talk capital and operational. That dwarfs the next 5 largest cities in the U.S. combined. You control, as we're going to talk about, water from the reservoir all the way to the tap, some of the best drinking water in the world. You have 40,000 police officers, 200+ municipal employees, just an amazingly powerful system. And yet, many of the things that make New York City more livable, sustainable, resilient have to be done in concert with the state, with New Jersey, with the surrounding counties, with the national government, with the private sector, with civil society and the institutions like PACE and all these other institutions. This requires the leveraging and the use of both soft power and hard power around coalition building and around using the things that are at your disposal. And if you only write strategies and if you as a mayor or as a chief resilience officer working for a mayor only think about things in your formal authority, you will miss what the opportunities are. And this is particularly true in water, that you see water systems that extend far beyond a city's boundaries and really have to do with what's happening upstream and upriver. I think Mexico City is in the process of creating a water fund that will help change the incentives for upstream actors, industry and so on, to take better care of the water sources so that they are properly incentivized for that to come back into Mexico City, because Mexico City will not on its own, despite the fact that it's one of the largest cities in the world, will not on its own solve its solve its water crisis that's here now and getting worse. And then last point, and then I'll stop, is that infrastructure. We're going to build many, over the next 20 years, we are going to build many trillions of dollars of infrastructure in cities around the world. Some of that will be around water, either flood protection or fresh drinking water systems. They estimate that by 2050, 75% of the infrastructure that will be in our cities has not been built yet. And so that is a massive opportunity, but it's also a massive risk. And this is Caracas, Venezuela, a country that is challenged in a lot of ways. But you can see this highway, which was built in the name of mobility, which everyone knows is the hallmark of a good, resilient city, has had some other effects. You see, these are slums, and these are wealthy areas, and the highway is a wall. It separates the slums. This is not integrated. This highway doesn't make Venezuela and Caracas stronger, it makes it weaker. And we don't have to look to Caracas for this lesson. This is the Bronx Expressway. You could argue the majority of many, let's not call it the majority, you can argue that many of the resilience challenges that New York has faced in the 4 or 5 decades since Moses built the Bronx Expressway have come in, at least in part, from the South Bronx and the social issues. The rotting apple, the Bronx is burning, riots after the 77 blackout, at least in part, came from that. They're not entirely responsible for it, but you can see how a well-intentioned intervention, if you you can argue whether Moses was well-intentioned or not, but a well-intentioned intervention can have these kind of impacts. And so we, as thinkers and planners and bureaucrats and NGOs, have a responsibility, and this is something I continue to stress to our chief resilience officers in our network. Sometimes the thing you don't build is as important as the thing you build. And it's not just about, and this is my last slide, it's not just about building new stuff, but it can be around repurposing stuff. To go back to my you'll think I'm in love with Medellin, which I am. but these are what are called uvas. They're big water storage containers in the hillsides. This is the valley floor that I talked about. These are some of the poor slums that are around the side of Medellin. Until recently, until about maybe 15 years ago, these things were walled off by barbed wire and security perimeter because they were worried about the security risk of people getting next to the storage containers. And what that had the effect of, it cut this community, and these girls are from a community that's right here, off from that community. And it created this massive segregating infrastructure. And so what Medellin has done, and there are about 25 of these that dot the city, and this is one, and one of the, beautiful picture, but is changed all of these, all 25 of them, into inviting public space where people can mingle and mix. And by doing that, they have, I would argue, enhanced the resilience of the city to deal with whatever the next crisis is, because people are healthier, happier, more integrated in their space. And you can see it's just an amazing, here are these little fountains, these beautiful walkways, and people looking over this beautiful city at night. So it's not just about new infrastructure, it's not just about building infrastructure, but it's about thinking about what the right solution is, because that will help make your city or your country more able to deal with whatever the next shock and stress is. Thank you very much.